Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cora, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you about my latest research findings about the portrayal of Chinese international students, a critical review. I would like to thank, first of all, to Peter for his kind introduction, and I would also like to thank Dr. 𝗃𝗲𝗁 for inviting me to give this talk, and to Will for his excellent administrative support. I'm an assistant professor in education at Durham University, and you can follow me on Twitter. I'm quite active on Twitter at Cora Lingling Xu, and you can also follow my research network, which Peter has kindly mentioned, at 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁𝗃𝗶𝗶𝗄. I'm also quite active on social media. I have set up social media channels called 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁𝗃𝗶𝗶𝗄 or Dr. Xu Gazing at Academia, both on Bilibili, Xiaohongshu, and YouTube. And so on these channels, I shared my tips, observations, and sometimes questions about academic job searches, about academic reading and writing. So you're more than welcome to follow me. Right. So let me just share the full screen. Right, so my paper today is based on this article that I published in December 2021 in the Asia Pacific Education Review. If you're interested, you are more than welcome to access it. It's open access to read the entire article. So this research has also recently been featured on BBC Radio 4 documentary called Chinese on Campus. And this is the link, but if you just Google Chinese on Campus BBC Radio 4, you'll be able to locate the link on Google. And if you don't already have a BBC account, you will need to spend about 1 minute to register an account to listen to this program in full. Right, so in my paper today, I would like to begin with an introduction to outline the literature gaps that motivated this piece of research. And in particular, I want to discuss why I include not only the English language literature, but also the Chinese language literature from a post-colonial lens. I will then briefly mention what I mean by subject positions in this paper. I will also briefly touch upon the research method and then delve into the core of today's talk, which are the 4 subject positions: the neoliberal, the political, pedagogic, and racialized subject positions of the Chinese international students. And then I would have a brief discussion based on the 2 bodies of literature that I reviewed. Right. So the Chinese international students have often been understood as a monolithic, highly homogeneous, and indeed faceless group, whether in state policies, in media discourse, or scholarly discussions. Now, as a major source of knowledge production about the Chinese international students, scholarly representations of the Chinese international students occupy a pivotal position in shaping public views of this group of students. Indeed, wide-ranging scholarship on the Chinese international students has mushroomed across the cogent fields of education, sociology, human geography, anthropology, psychology, tourism research, business research, and marketing research. Integrating these disparate bodies of academic research to focus the field and make further progress seems pivotal. However, when examining the literature, we find only 3 seminal reviews, respectively by Henze and Zhu 2012, Suspicina and Schalke 2019, and Zhang Wu 2018. And without exception, all of these have focused only on the English language representations, either scholarly representations or media representations, without engaging the Chinese counterpart. With such an aim or with such a view, this paper aims to provide a more updated and comprehensive review in order to capture the state of the scholarship and hopefully pinpoint gaps and future directions. In this paper, I draw on the post-colonial lenses such as Edward Said's Orientalism and his very incisive critique about the Western dominant cultural hegemony, not only in the production and reproduction of individual subjects, but also in the knowledge production sphere, i.e. scholarly works. In particular, I note that Western dominance and the othering of the Orient have often manifested through the privileging of English language publications and the marginalization of the so-called indigenous or native language publications. For instance, we see that there is a substantial body of research published in the native language of these Chinese international students, i.e. Chinese, and yet they have received very little international attention, if at all. I point out in this paper, therefore, following speech Sina and 𝗱𝗃𝗲𝗄 2019, that the privileging of English language publications can create subject positions that contribute to their own subjectification, meaning that such hegemonic dominance of the colonial language can produce and reproduce subjects that are submitting to the Western dominant cultural hegemony. Therefore, I argue that this paper's attempt to bring the Chinese language literature into the picture and hopefully bridging a dialogue is a first step to challenging the hierarchies of knowledge production. And more specifically, in this paper, I will affirm the legitimacy, the relevance, and epistemic contributions of the Chinese language literature. It should be noted, however, that this does not mean that I have a blanket endorsement of the Chinese language literature. Rather, as you will soon see, this will be a critical review of both bodies of literature. Right, so why do I choose to focus on the Chinese international students' portrayed subject positions? Now, in this paper, subject positions refer to the socially constructed subjectivities assigned to the Chinese international students within the two bodies of literature that I review. And I maintain that academic research and indeed the discursive work done within research can be construed as technologies, well, in a Foucauldian sense, and such technologies would then in turn turn these Chinese international students or create these international students from China as subjects. Right, so indeed, in the most cutting edge research in the field, scholars such as Sweat and colleagues and Hearn have constantly noted that the Chinese international students are often depicted in limited, static, and sometimes implicitly negative and lopsided ways. In view of these biased portrayals, these scholars have called for researchers to be transparent about and revise their ideological constructions of these students. While these scholars were mostly referring to Western scholars, in this paper I attempt to interrogate the ideological constructions of both Chinese and Western or non-Chinese scholars who publish either in English or in Chinese about this group of students. Now, in this paper, I focused my attention on peer-reviewed journal articles published between 2015 and 2020, using keyword searches on the 𝗃𝗃𝗲𝗃𝗃𝗶𝗶𝗄 中国之王, which is the world's biggest and continuously updated Chinese journals database, and Google Scholar, which has the most comprehensive coverage of scholarly literature in social sciences. Together, I collated 74 Chinese language articles and 128 English language articles in this review exercise. I will not go into too many details here, but if you're interested in the methodology, we can discuss more later. Right, so together, I initially identified 8 subject positions in my thematic narrative review. Apart from these 4 identified here, neoliberal, political, pedagogic, and racialized subject positions, I also included caring and feeling subject, gendered and sexualized subject, religious subject, and economic subject. But due to space constraints in academic publishing, I focus on the 4 most substantial subject positions, i.e. the neoliberal, the political, the pedagogic, and the racialized subject positions. In this table, you can see on the left-hand side column, you can see the number of articles from each body of language that are under each subject position. For instance, you can see that for the pedagogic subject position, which is number 3, the great majority was from the English language literature with 34 out of 38, while only 4 Chinese language articles touched upon this subject position. Conversely, if you look at number 2, the political subject position, you can see that the number of Chinese language articles focusing on this subject position is 3 times that of its English counterpart. These observations will serve as useful pointers for our comparison and discussion later on. Now, focusing on the specifics of each subject position, you can see some subcategories under each subject position. To begin with, under the neoliberal subject position, this paper notes the familiar portrayal of Chinese international students as cash cows, who are primarily valued for their economic contributions to the institutional financial coffer of often Western-based higher education institutions. In this process, some literature notes how these students have themselves been embedded in the global neoliberal machinery by voting with their feet and indeed their fees to perpetuate global inequalities, for instance, earning degrees from prestigious universities in the West and using such degrees to gain competitive edges in the job market, becoming thoroughly neoliberal. However, this was what was most intriguing is that within this subject position, these Chinese students are often also responsibilized for their own successes or failures, instrumentalized as means for achieving China's modernization endeavor, while they and their families became the only parties to show the risks. Moreover, due to probably unconscious subscription to neoliberal logics, researchers of Chinese international students, like myself, but I'm not saying that I do that, but researchers of Chinese international students, they often feel compelled to emphasize these students' economic contributions as a means to justify any need to research these students. Thus, to some extent, perpetuate the narrative that these students are commodities and cash cows and fail to recognize the fact that they are humans and indeed very unique humans and with unique stories. And this is therefore a cautionary tale for those of us who are allies of Chinese international students. Right. Moving on to the political subject position, it is intriguing to note that the Chinese international students are often treated as instruments of states, both by the successive Chinese governments and foreign states. When I refer to the successive Chinese governments, I include, because in the literature it included the Qing government in the 1800s, the Republican government in the 1910s to 1940s, and the PRC from 1949 to the present. And as for foreign governments, the literature has covered the US government and the Japanese government, for instance. In this respect, the Chinese international students are often considered as tools for these governments to exert influence over other governments and countries. For instance, through being cultural ambassadors or people-to-people diplomats, especially when the home and destination countries are getting on in good diplomatic terms. Now, however, when the international relations between China and the foreign states, the destination countries, turn sour or turn tense, the Chinese international students are often considered as potential spies, again, by both governments, the home government and the foreign states. And they have been found to be subjected to detention and sometimes imprisonment. As such, they are often rendered as political and diplomatic sacrifices of nation states, both China and foreign governments. The political subject position can also be manifested in these Chinese international students' ethno-national positions. For instance, research has revealed how some Chinese international students in the US, for instance, can often be caught in the middle of war of words by foreign peers who might hold in quotation mark, biased views about China and trying hard to defend their motherland's image and practices. Most intriguingly, the political subject position is most adamantly reflected through their ideological positions. They are at times positioned as ideological mediators. For instance, in the early 1900s, the Chinese international students were found to be spreading Japanese Marxism to China. At other times, they are found to be striving hard to negotiate what democracy means and how it works when studying in Western democratic countries. This literature highlights the complexities of their subjective development and inherent conflicts and struggles that these students experienced when attempting to understand and to engage with Western-style democracy. More importantly, these Chinese international students are often considered as malleable and suspicious, ideological subjects whose ideological inclinations have to be carefully vetted before they were sent abroad. For instance, within the Sino-Soviet relations in the 1950s and 60s, or during their studies abroad, and of course, after they have returned. Concerted efforts have been made to orient their ideological development positively so as for them to be aligned with those of the nation state. Now, moving on to the pedagogic subject position, while there continues to be a number of articles that portray the Chinese international students as deficient, incompetent, reticent learners who lack critical thinking skills, a nascent body of literature in both Chinese and English language has begun to critique and indeed challenge such portrayals. Instead, this new literature has argued that the Chinese students' pedagogic needs are perfectly legitimate and should not be considered as deviant from the image and needs of a normalized Western-centered learner. This literature also challenges the idea of critical thinking as a purely Western construct and questions the legitimacy of Western-centric pedagogic practices. Along the same line, this literature has evidenced the agentic, methodical, resourceful, and innovative nature of Chinese international students as knowledgeable educators and indeed thinkers. Now, moving on to the racialized subject position, a group of articles has noted that racial discriminations have been experienced by the Chinese international students, both on university campuses and in the job markets, again, mostly abroad when we talk about the job markets. While another group took this matter much further to problematize the colored blindness and neo-racism of international, institutional, and individual practices. And this literature is mostly based in the US. It is intriguing that Chinese international students' racial identifications have also been shown to be quite fluid, as shaped by the amount of time they spend abroad and the specific national contexts that they are in. Right. Also, the Chinese international students are found to have some simplistic understanding of different racial groups in their naive engagement with racialized discourses and interracial relations. These studies thus depart from the Chinese international students being passive recipients of racialized treatments, but accentuate their role as discerning racialized subjects. Notably, there has been little attention, though, paid to the ethnically diverse nature of Chinese international students. As we know, in China, there are 55 officially recognized ethnic minority groups, but in this body of literature, more than 200 articles, both Chinese and English, that I reviewed, only one article addresses the experiences of ethnic minority students from China, experiences in their study abroad. Right. Now, apart from discerning the subject positions, in this paper, I also mapped out the author's background, identifying where the authors were based at the time of publication and whether they received research training, meaning master's and PhD education outside mainland China, and whether they were ethnic Chinese. You can see in this table that for the authors of the Chinese language articles, a great majority were based in mainland China when the articles were published and were ethnic Chinese. And only 1/5 or less than that, in fact, 19 out of 106, who actually received a research training outside of mainland China. In comparison, in the English language literature, more than 1/5 were based in China when these articles were published. And around half of the authors were actually not ethnic Chinese. Now, I'm not suggesting that these will necessarily dictate their approaches or ideological positioning, but these are nonetheless important contextual factors for our discussion. And here comes our discussion. Overall, I note that the Chinese language literature has a predominant focus on the historical studies of Chinese international students, especially on the modern China period, which means the Qing Dynasty and the Republic of China period. Now, this is very interesting because this is unparalleled by its English language counterparts, because all of the English language articles have a contemporary focus. Also, the Chinese language literature has a predominant focus on these students' political subject positions, while its English language counterparts pays much less attention to the political subject position, but more on the neoliberal and pedagogic subject positions, and also a bit on the racialized subject positions. Now, for the Chinese language literature that indeed focuses on contemporary contexts, it has shunned its political subject position or its focus on the political subject positions of these students. And this could be explained through the issues of censorship and self-censorship. However, there's still some that focuses on contemporary context, but also focuses on the political position, but they focus more on the ideological aspect on how they can shape these students' ideological sort of value systems and patriotism, how these can be cultivated. And this can be explained, and here I draw on Simon Martinson's work, through the notion of the scholar in Chinese society stemming from imperial Chinese traditions, where you have to sit the imperial exam and become a government official. So studying and doing probably research in the imperial sense, and then you will become a government official, trying to rule the country as a result. So both bodies of literature have seen a nascent literature that challenges the universal superiority of Westernized critical thinking and emphasizes the epistemic contributions, meaning knowledge contributions, and heterogeneity of Chinese students, which is heartening to see. Also, both bodies of literature have shown that national states, higher education institutions, the media, and even certain researchers might have exploited the vulnerabilities of the Chinese international students. Now, this is not to negate the enormous sense of agency of the Chinese international students, and also in some sense their acquiescence to the global neoliberal machinery and order.